The podcast you're about to listen to is from a book series on postqualitative, new materialist and critical posthumanist research. You can find it on the following website, www.postqualitativeresearch.com.
Hello, my name's Simone Fullagar, and I'm going to talk about my chapter today entitled Returning to Embodied Matters and Movement. So in this chapter, I'm riffing off Karen Barad's notion of the return. So she talks about this idea in terms of moving us away from assumptions about reflection and reflective practice. So she's saying it's not like reflection on how we think about bodies or ourselves or movement in this case, as in going back to the past, turning it over and over again. Instead, she says, we might imagine returning as a multiplicity of processes, such as the kind earthworms revel in while helping to make compost or otherwise being busy at work and at play. End of quote. So this notion of returning to bodies is something that I have found really compelling by engaging with materialist feminisms, feminist work on the body that has occurred over a long period of time from different perspectives, and thinking about this in the context of post-qualitative inquiry and how we might actually produce knowledge in different ways if we think with the materiality of movement relations. Okay, so some big ideas coming through here, but I'm interested in how we put them to work. So how we return to those practice and methodological questions which require us to think differently and draw on concepts and enact theory and practice relationships differently. So how do we move away from historically problematic relations of embodiment and ways of thinking about bodies as separate from the world? So the famous Cartesian dualisms of mind and body, reason and emotion, masculine, feminine, nature, culture, all of these black-white, all of these dualisms which have meant the body has been subjugated to reason, to being seen as inert kind of matter, as dumb matter, as nature, as unmediated by culture. So the ideas of posthumanism and post-qualitative inquiry and the work of a whole lot of feminist scholars in queer studies, Crip studies, black feminism work, First Nations work, really important in repositioning our understanding of embodiment as in terms of bodies that matter, and how's meaning and matter entangled and produced through different ways of moving our bodies. So our bodies are always moving in many different ways. Often we're not even aware of it. So that brings into question the kind of habits of movement that become enculturated, that become lived through our bodies. So these are questions of embodiment and movement that are conscious and unconscious, that are profoundly affective, that connect us to the forces in the world. And those forces are sociocultural, profoundly political, and they're also bound up with biology, physiology, and also our broader, more than human worlds, how we move through worlds, with worlds, how we are moved by worlds in particular ways. So all of these big questions about how we think about embodied movement have been questions I've been interested in pursuing in relation to different kinds of, we might call, intentional movement practices. So I come from a background in sociology and feminist theory around sport, leisure, health, well-being practices, and thinking about those spheres of life as they are profoundly gendered, for example, also racialized. We also think about the way in which people of quite diverse backgrounds experience pleasure in movement, but also shame and exclusion. So whenever we are moving, In public spaces, we are subjected to a whole range of affective forces that means movement can be, might be empowering, might be profoundly frightening, violence. So there are many ways of moving our bodies that, for example, policy discourses around being more active, playing more sport, health and well-being, good for us, mental health and physical health, all of those kinds of common sense health education, health promotion discourses, they profoundly misunderstand the complexity of our embodied relations. So what I'm trying to do in this chapter is think about different ways in which we can engage in research methods and practices that bring us back to these complexities and help us think through movement relations. And hence, we start to move away from thinking about the body as an object or a thing and start to think about how our bodies, in their multiplicity, through our senses, the way in which we bring our histories, our pasts, and the way in which we engage with places and their histories. Places are haunted, they have multiple histories, some of which we may not even recognise because of the violence of colonialism, for example. The way in which nature has been backgrounded as simply a resource to be used for our movement. So human-centred ideas that are still caught up in those dichotomies. So what happens if we put our bodies to work in new ways and we think about researching movement for a range of purposes? And I'm quite interested in thinking about 3 different aspects of movement in this chapter, or 3 different ways of approaching it. And one is thinking about walking methodologies. And there's a huge literature on ways of walking and how we can put walking to use to explore different knowledge practices, worlding practices, ways of creating different ways of moving that might be more inclusive, that might have a less environmental impact, that might surface different histories that we weren't previously aware of. So there are many ways of walking that can produce different knowledges, and this might be something that you want to experiment with in putting movement to work in your own research practices. So what does it mean to engage in ways of walking where you might shut off certain senses and you might open up other senses to have appreciation of what a crip body or a queer body or a black body might experience, or challenge the kind of normal, ableist, white constructions of worlds and the way in which worlds materialise through bodies. So starting with that notion of being in the speculative middle of walking and thinking about research practice, not necessarily by designing a watertight project up front, but starting in the middle and going walking in places and thinking about what are the modes of engagement and how do those places speak back and how do they disturb. And also that's not simply relying on the body as a kind of phenomenological source of knowledge, but also recognising the material and the discursive and how they come together. So you might be walking to libraries, you might be researching in archives, you might be talking with First Nations elders about the kinds of complex histories that have not been documented by oral cultures. There are lots of different ways to think about how our bodies and places relate and interact, as Barad says. So bodies and worlds are never separate, but they come together in certain ways through movement that can be particularly powerful. So it might be if you're running a class, you might take postgraduate students on a walk to see what that produces. If you are doing research, you might think about, well, how could I approach this research question or topic through involving movement in my methodological practices? What does that movement do? What can it enable in terms of disturbing or shifting or opening up different possibilities? And another aspect of movement relations is thinking specifically about dance practices and movement practices where there's a desire to engage in movement because of its freedom and pleasure. That doesn't mean it's necessarily an undisciplined practice. It is quite highly disciplined, but doesn't always have to be so. So many of the traditions of dance and the skill embodied practices are learned, have long histories, and they can produce also quite shaming relations to the body or one's body, and that is often quite gendered too. So thinking about the way in which movement can open up, and different kind of dance practices or movement practices can shift away from some of those disciplinary logics to free up different kinds of expression. One of the projects that I've worked on that I've written about in the chapter is related to somatic movement workshops. So somatic movement workshops are very much about experimenting with the body and attuning to embodied movement. So not privileging the mind or cognition and trying to enact a movement in accordance to how a disciplined practice would occur in terms of training and things like that. This is more about a different logic, which is about listening to the body, attuning to the body, noticing where tension is held, and noticing how you can move your body in ways that are more comfortable, where you can move with ease. So an exercise I like to do to think about this is to imagine or practice getting up off the floor in a way that feels less awkward, it feels more comfortable. How do we think about our body relations in that space? Do we use the floor, furniture? How do we understand the way in which we can leverage our body and move? The different muscles that we use in our body. All of those micro movements are bound up with habits that are profoundly sociocultural and also political in terms of what we've been able to learn about our bodies. So thinking about ways of moving with ease that also encourage people who have been excluded from certain movement practices and traditions and sports, physical activities, to engage in more pleasurable ways to counter some of those shaming forces. So somatic movement practices can be a really important source of knowledge, of coming to know how to move differently and open up different creative practices from that. So one of the challenges, I think, when we're writing and researching with movement is this whole question of representation. And how do we speak through our bodies? How do we represent them in a way that's not falling into a representational paradigm, as Karen Barad would say, so that we bring the materiality of the body and movement practice to our writing as academics. We are usually writing our work, but not always. We're speaking, and we might also engage in research practices that use different arts-based methods. So when I'm working on a project around women's experience of somatic movement and trying to draw out the gendered dimension of that within the workshop as a creative space, I'm also interested in how I can use arts-based methods to complement this. So I'm using the body mapping methodological practice, but I don't use it in the humanist sense of encouraging, in this instance, participants who identify as women to represent or map or draw the truth of their experience. I'm more interested in what the movement practices and engagement in dance does when they start to draw through their ideas of gender, through their ideas of embodiment. So the awkwardness, the discomfort, but also what is profoundly important and opens up different effective forces and relations for them. So this can be quite a powerful creative moment. And that's where I think bringing arts together with movement really can help generate different kinds of creative knowledge practices and different worlding experiences, where you as a researcher aren't necessarily in the middle of that process directing what should happen. It's really more of a speculative emergent process. So meaning and movement do things when you bring them together in ways that can be very supportive and embrace an ethic of care as well. So participants co-creating knowledge with you as a researcher. So that would be an interesting aspect to think about. What kinds of creative practices can you use to see what you can generate in terms of knowledge, either as yourself as a researcher or in collaboration with others? And that might be writing practices, drawing, painting, it could be using music. There are lots of different dimensions of arts-based practice that can be used to put movement to work in different ways. So that we start to move right away from a notion of the body as a bounded entity and take up more diffuse, more than human understandings of what bodies can do in terms of different sites of engagement, in terms of thinking about the multiplicities of engagement, senses, spaces, the non-human around us, whether that's natural environment or built environments and spaces, and other types of bodies and practices, as well as the digital. So Erin Manning has this lovely quote where she talks about bodies and movement and dance practices, and she said, it's really thinking about the edges and the intensities and the contours that shape our embodied movement practices and shape our experiences of worlds. So we can look for those kind of points of connection and disconnection that shift our understandings, that diffract normative views of what bodies are and what bodies do, and hence what knowledge is and how we can produce knowledge in different ways. So I would encourage you to play with movement and to engage in little everyday movement experiments to see where that takes you, to really unearth and question some of the normative assumptions we make about bodies and about knowledge practices that have historically been very much tied to those dualistic constructions. So see where embodied movement can take you and see how knowledge practices can materialise in different ways.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to know more about this chapter, please visit the website www.postqualitativeresearch.com, and please stay tuned for future podcasts.